Well, good afternoon, everybody. And on behalf of the Northern Neck National Heritage Area and the Northern Neck 250 Coalition, I want to welcome you to the fifth and final event in our 2024 Signature Speaker Series. This speaker series focuses on the history of the Northern Neck and is a four-year commemoration of the birth of our nation. Our theme this year, as a lot of you know, is Power of Place. So place offers a powerful lens through which we can view the past. It challenges us to think beyond modern political boundaries and to consider the full history of our region and the United States. It encourages us to reconsider significant questions about our history, to re-examine ideas about our natural and built environments, and to reorient when and where we find our country's history. Dr. Philip Levy is with us today to share his perspective on Power of Place by exploring how consumerism shaped a response to the 1765 Stamp Act, influenced revolutionary politics, and ultimately helped drive revolutionary sentiment here on the Northern Neck. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to ask that you take a moment to silence cell phones and also ask that you hold any questions until the end of the presentation. And now it's my pleasure to tell you more about our speaker. Dr. Levy is a professor of history at the University of South Florida and is an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. He's the author of several books, many of which deal with George Washington, both as a person and a national icon. Where the Cherry Tree Grew, The Story of Ferry Farm, George Washington's boyhood home, and George Washington Written Upon the Land, Nature, Memory, Myth, and Landscape focus on the places of Washington's childhood. The Permanent Resident, Excavations and Explorations of the Life of George Washington explores the many sites of Washington's life and how their stories have been shaped by archaeology and issues of memory and commemoration. The Permanent Resident is also the winner of the prestigious Society for Historical Archaeology's James Deetz Book Award. In addition to those publications, Dr. Levy is also the author of this park's 2023 Historic Resource Study entitled Upon This Land, 7 Generations of Washington Family and the Residents of Pope's Creek and Maddox Neck. His newest book, Yardbirds, The Lives and Times of America's Urban Chickens, tells a very different story from his other work and explores how chickens and cities have shaped one another. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Levy.
Let's not trip on any cords. Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thanks for inviting me here. Thank you for coming out on this warm afternoon to experience cooler but yet somewhat warm. I think we'll make it though. I think we're going to survive. So in putting this talk together, I should say also thank you for the chance to sort of spend more time or review time with the Stamp Act. What always happens with texts like this is you read them, you're familiar with them from graduate school and if not earlier, but it's only when you really have to start to think about them that you suddenly read them really closely. So one of the nice things, and this was for me, was going back and really reading carefully through the Stamp Act and thinking about some of the implications. What happens with a talk like this, though, is what you think you're going to say and what you actually end up saying often deviate quite a bit. Our focus is the Leedstown Resolves, the Leedstown Resolutions, and the beginning of the Westmoreland Association, and how that comes into being in the context of the Stamp Act and what that means for the larger revolution. There's a lot to say about that. I suspect some of you are fairly familiar with the Leedstown Resolves and know stuff about it, but I'm going to pitch to the broad audience, so some of the stuff you might know already. But when I start to put this together, it takes weeks to get a good PowerPoint together. I hope this is a good PowerPoint. I found myself wanting to have you look at text a lot. And I was like writing things out and cutting and pasting and realizing there's a lot of words here. And nominally we're talking about a document, but that document's in response to a document. So there are a lot of words. And I thought about how do we approach this? I have quotations that I'll put up for you to look at. I thought about printing something out to hand out, but then I realized that you could probably get some of the most important text that we're going to look at just on your phones, and we don't have to use any paper for that. And I noticed, I didn't make a slide of it, but I will tell you for now that if for those who are interested and feel able, which wish to do it, The Wikipedia, of all things, has a very good text of the Leedstown Resolutions. And it might be interesting to kind of go there when we start to talk about that text more in detail. Initially, I'm going to work my way toward consumerism, but what started happening was when I started burrowing into the text and what I thought you needed to hear, the text kind of took over. So we end up with a somewhat different story. I want to wend my way toward consumerism, and particularly how things relate to this landscape. Because as Melissa mentioned, I've worked in this landscape considerably. I'm not done with it. I have 2 book projects in the process right now, both that deal with this site. So I like to bring things back here wherever possible. And of course, this is where we are. So let's let the power of place work a little bit and ask us to kind of look closely here. So I'm going to try to work my way through there. We'll see how far I get. But I want to begin by showing you, by recommending another talk. This conversation between Patrick Mullins and George Stiffy that was put on by Stratford Hall is really worth your time. We only have an hour at the longest, and we need 45 minutes or so for me. This is a 2-hour conversation, better part of 2 hours. There's a lot of detail in there, some great detail about the Stamp Act protest that took place in Montrose, Virginia, which some of you may know about, but I recommend this talk. And I'm kind of, as I was looking it over, this happened in February, as I was looking it over, some of the questions that they were asking resonated with me. One of the things they were dealing with was, why were the Leedstown Resolves as radical as they were in their moment? Those of you familiar with them know that they sort of anticipate later language. They're a little bit ahead of their time. And so asking that question, why are they as radical as they are? And while they're talking about that, I kind of want to zoom in on that and use that as a thread and kind of get at some of the issues that are driving the radicalism of that document. So let's start with the basic story and get ourselves up to speed here. So in February of 1765, a Scots merchant in Tappahannock, Virginia, made it known, presumably it sounds like he did it in Essex County Court, that he was going to be shipping a cargo of grain to the West Indies, and he was going to do it in adherence to the law. That's a crucial point. The law had changed. The law was coming into being, and at that point, by February, it was pending, and it had come into place, and people were beginning to raise questions. He announced that he was going to do this legally. This caused a lot of consternation and concern. He was shipping grain to the West Indies, and he offered that if anybody was willing to buy out his cargo at 2,800 pounds, he'd be willing to sell it rather than take legal paper and ship to the West Indies. So he's often sort of the villain in this story, or at least the story starts with Ritchie. But I looked through a series of databases about the Atlantic slave trade to see if I could find Ritchie's involvement in that trade, although there are at least 2 ship owners with the name Ritchie. He's not one of them. I don't know how he might be related to the others. And the only thing we have says he's going to the West Indies, so it's not clear specifically where in the West Indies he was headed. But Virginia had a long history of provisioning into the West Indies, particularly the lower rivers had a lot of provisioning activity going on. A place like Barbados, for example, which you're looking at a little bit of here, land is too valuable for sugar to put into corn. So if you can import the corn, you import the corn and put every acre into sugar. So Virginia had a very lively provisioning trade to the West Indies. And it would seem that Ritchie was participating in that trade. So let's give him his due. It was already clear that West Indian ports were not going to accept vessels that didn't have legal paper. Many of them had been turned away, and by that time, at least 8 cargoes had been confiscated by authorities at West Indian ports. So when Ritchie said he was going to ship legally, he may have known what he was talking about. He may have been trying to go the safe route and get his cargo handled properly. But there was such strong sentiment against the Stamp Act in this colony. I always like to ask if people know how many English colonies there were in the 1760s, and most people get the answer wrong because the answer is 26. We lose sight of that because we focus on the 13 mainland ones, and we don't think about this larger world where there are a lot of other British colonies who did not participate in the Revolution. Barbados is a wonderful example of that. Barbados is a place where about 90% of the people were enslaved, and so the sense of law and order there functions rather differently than it might in a place like Rhode Island, where you have a much smaller enslaved population. The role of British authority functions very differently. The agent for Barbados in this moment, listening to North American concerns about the Stamp Act, said, I can paraphrase it, but he said, "We think similarly about this issue, as do our brethren on the mainland, but think is all we shall do." So in other words, they agree, but they won't take action. So in the West Indies, from Jamaica and Barbados particularly, there was a lot of compliance with the Stamp Act. They didn't like it, but they went along with it. And that's an important difference because things went differently in the northern colonies, in the mainland colonies. So once Ritchie makes this announcement, or is heard to be doing this, this causes a bunch of consternation in the area. On February 21st, a mob of at least 70 men showed up at Ritchie's house. That house, some of you might know, in Tappahannock is called the Customs House, but this is where Ritchie was living at the time. It's right on the waterfront, a perfect place for someone like him. And they make their displeasure known. The details of that are unclear. There's one story that says that it got bad enough that a merchant of war, a warship in the harbor sent Marines to shore to kind of break up the mob. They may have broken windows that would not have been out of keeping with what was happening in 1766. But they make it clear to Ritchie that they don't want him to do this. And it concerns Richard Henry Lee enough that he wrote very quickly to Samuel Washington, who was living in Chotank at the time. This is one of George's younger brothers, born here, moved first to Mount Vernon when the family moved there, then moved on to Ferry Farm. He will ultimately move out to West Virginia, along with his brother Charles, and situate themselves on land that the family had owned for a while. But that matters quite a bit in the context of the 1760s. Lee was very concerned about this, and he wrote to Samuel Washington, and they set a meeting up. And on the 27th of February, they assembled a group of men, we're not sure the exact number, but 115 of them signed the document, the Leedstown Resolves, that was penned, we believe, by Richard Henry Lee. And then those people attach their names to it. So that's sort of the long and short. You get this document, they then go, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. They go revisit Ritchie, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So this is dramatic action. This is quick action. Why are they so concerned about this? What is going on? How can we understand this? How can we understand what's energizing them around this change of law? Taxes aren't new. There were all kinds of taxes in the colonial system. The colonial system was heavily bureaucratized. Much more so in some ways. You have to kind of come to our world to understand the level of bureaucracy that they confront. There's a lot of bureaucracy in their world. There are inspectors of all sorts, there are duties of all sorts, and they've been paying them for ages. Why is something going wrong here? And it bears on the big question of the revolution that I think a lot of people have misunderstood over the years. There's a tendency, if you look at it casually, to imagine that what happens is the colonies develop and develop and develop, and eventually just sort of mature to their liberty. And sort of end their relationship with Britain at that point. And that's the wrong way to see it. What's happening in this period, in the second half of the 18th century particularly, is what scholars have called the Anglicization. That you have a lot of migrants coming from Britain. There's an uptick in migrants from Britain. So a lot of these people are Englishmen proper and use that language. Also, the material side of things. Britain is now controlling trade to the colonies very heavily. And it's not an accident that manufactured goods appear over and over again in the concerns raised by the colonists, at least the freeholder colonists, the free white colonists, in their objection to these laws. So what changed was not anything in the Americas. What changed was Britain's relationship to the Americas. So the change is more on that side than it is on the American side. And to understand that, we need to understand a few different things. One of them is this guy, George William Frederick, King George III, who came to power in 1760. So right as the 7 Years' War is ending, you get a new king who had ideas, had a sense of how an empire could be run more efficiently than it had been being run. Now, of course, he's not the sole decision maker. It's not that kind of monarchy, but he carries a lot of weight and he has a lot of influence in British politics, and his allies sort of work with him or work with his camp. I'm sharing this from a historian named Robert Paulette, a good friend of mine, who shared this recently. I've seen this portrait 1,000 times without ever noticing this, but do you see what's going on there? Kind of a brilliant little deal there. George is England. See the way his ermine is draped? He is replicating the shape of England. It's a wonderful statement of monarchical authority there. So he is England, sort of a beautiful painting. So he comes into power right as the 7 Years' War is ending. As some of you know, the 7 Years' War began thanks to whom? George Washington sort of begins the 7 Years' War with the first truly global conflict, an incredibly important conflict on so many different levels, and lasts longer in America than it did in other parts of the world. But this is a war that's fought in Europe, it's fought in India, it's fought in the West Indies, it's fought in North America, colossal conflict. And mostly on the continent, on the mainland, it was fought north of us. Virginia puts a lot of energy into it, has forts, but the fighting is primarily, and you know this because you know the stories, we think of this primarily as a northern set of events. It culminates with the fall of Quebec, which is the end of French Canada's administrative state. First, the city of Quebec falls, and then Montreal falls the following year. And that's basically the end of the French Empire, at least in North America, on the land for the most part. Now, with Britain winning, Treaty of Paris, 1763, is the moment at which the empire sort of shifts hands. And Britain suddenly has a problem that it's the problem of winning. Right? Sometimes winning brings its own problems. The wars had been, at least in the North American side, had been very much between indigenous people allied with the French Empire and colonists who were always looking westward and expanding. And the Crown would like to not have that happen again. The Crown's also worried that France is going to make another play to come back and try to retake their land. So they're very concerned about exactly how to prevent that from happening. And so this new idea of empire, you have a new prime minister we'll get to in a moment who's sort of willing to play this game, sort of rethinking what policy can be. How should we manage this so that we don't end up in another colossal conflict? And one of the first things that happens is this royal proclamation that bars the settlement of British colonists past the Allegheny Mountains. It's called the Proclamation Line, and it marks it very clearly. A lot of Virginians had land claims on the west side of the Allegheny Mountains. So when they see the Crown do this immediately in the context of the Treaty of Paris, it gets their dander up a bit. They already have possessions and they have anticipated possessions. They're very concerned about this Western land. On the Northern Neck has always been about Western land. And so there are a lot of people here deeply involved in shifting indigenous land to English hands. That's been a project for a long time. On this landscape, it really begins in earnest in the 1650s, but carries on through. I always think that John Washington, the original Washington settler here, knew Indians personally and killed them, right? I mean, he participated in war against Native Americans. But his grandson, Augustine Washington, probably did not see a free indigenous person in his life. That's how much the change is here. There are people, Daniel Lisson, who lives not too far from here in the 1670s, is a translator. He has enough Algonquian that he can get paid as a translator. But you go a generation or two ahead and there's no one left. Only a few people here and there. So the clearing out of the indigenous population has been part of the project for a long time. Western lands are terribly vital, and so they're thinking very much about that. From the perspective of these freeholders, these free colonists, they see this as a complete betrayal of their interests. They see this as the Crown taking the side of the indigenous people over their own interests. So strike one, right? Right there is a concern that is gonna make them a little more edgy about other rules coming from London. When you look at the line, you can see what I'm talking about, that there's a pretty bold line, and while there is this new province of Quebec that's going to be part of the British Empire, there also is all this land that people, particularly here, Virginians, were looking at and expecting to move into and claim, with some of them having done it already, in the Ohio country, for example. And that is not open to them. So a big resentment kicks in at that moment. Then there's the debt for the war. And this has to be grappled with. The debt doubled during the course of the war. So Britain finds itself completely underwater with no meaningful new sources of revenue. Now, it's hoping it can extract more wealth through taxation of things like the fur trade in Canada, which it now owns, and the Hudson's Bay Company, which it's involved with, trying to get that revenue. Another reason that the Crown wants to ensure that there isn't conflict between its colonists and indigenous people. It wants to make sure that trade will function well now that it owns it, right? It wants to profit from it. So there's this debt. And then there's another cost. Wanting to make sure there won't be more conflict entails a plan to keep 10,000 British troops on the ground in America, in the mainland. And that's an estimated 220,000 pounds per year. So this is a very expensive problem. So how do you solve this problem? Well, there are methods. They usually involve taxation. And so you get a new prime minister in the form of George Grenville. It's a wonderful William Hoare painting of him during the Stamp Act period. He's painted here when he's thinking about the Stamp Act. It's kind of a great painting. It's kind of, can you see it? Can you see him sort of formulating it? Franklin said he was in love with it. So not Franklin in love with it. He said that Grenville was in love with the Stamp Act. It was a huge project for him, as we'll see. But here he is, and so he set about a series of taxations that will nominally go to fund the cost of keeping American troops on the ground. So initially they're saying we're not asking the colonists to share the burden of paying off the debt. Rather, we're asking for the upkeep of keeping troops on the ground, which they argue is in the colonists' interests, right? Protecting you and keeping the French away and keeping conflict away with indigenous people. So one of the first acts that follows this is the Sugar Act. This is a fairly standard form for these kinds of acts. There have been many before. This adds a new duty onto the importation of sugar. Sugar is a high value, expensive commodity. It comes from only a few places. It's a luxury item. It's not necessary, but it's a luxury item. Virginians are sensitive to this because they also produce a luxury item, or the mainstay of the economy, although there are many other economies active in the colony, but tobacco is also a luxury item that's easily taxed. The concern with this, though, so this doesn't seem unreasonable. You take a luxury item and you add a tax onto it. Theoretically, that has its own balance. The wealthiest people are the ones who are paying that tax, although it filters down. So why would this cause so much resentment? Well, it causes resentment because it's perceived, and fairly, as a burden on the purchaser, but not on the seller. So that the planters on the islands, who are phenomenally wealthy, and this can't be stressed enough, they are so much wealthier than Virginians, even the wealthiest of Virginians. When George visited Barbados and looked at the plantations, you could read it in his journal, he's dumbfounded. There are people with 400 acres, which is actually a fairly large plantation in Barbados. There are people with 400 acres who are staggeringly more wealthy than his own father with 10,000 acres. So you just make so much more money out of sugar. And some of that money, some of them, that wealth allows you to not even have to live in the West Indies. They live in London, right? There's still a case of this. There's a Drax who's still the owner of the Drax plantation on Barbados. I've met the overseer on that plantation. There is a sugar plantation run by an overseer. Drax is in Parliament, right? He's a London guy. I think he's from London, at least I shouldn't say, not sure. But he's in Britain. You don't have to live in the West Indies. You can go live in lovely London in a lovely row house and have the city life. So enormous amounts of resentment for these guys. So the perception that they are being enriched on the backs of the planters here is another concern. So that's a second strike. They're feeling this particularly singularly. And as I mentioned before, Virginia has a long history of a provisioning trade with the West Indies. That trade is a two-way trade. It's not just shipping things back. When you go back to John Washington's period here, one of the principal things they bring from Barbados is, does anybody know what that is? What's the main thing they bring from Barbados? Enslaved people. Barbados serves as a trans-shipping point. So Africans are brought from the continent to Barbados and they're transshipped. Sometimes they're only there for a week and then transshipped up to Virginia. When you look at where shipments are coming from, they're invariably from Barbados. They start to be from Africa once the British take over the slave trade in the beginning of the 18th century. But before that, everything comes from Barbados. And you can see trade relations with Barbados and track them out and see who is purchasing enslaved people in the 17th century. And it ties to who's tied to Barbados. John Washington has seems to be enslaving at least 8 people by the time of his death, maybe more. Not many more, though. It's a huge number for this part of the world. There are almost no enslaved people here at the time of his death, 1670s. But he has some trade connections to Barbados. So that's an important piece of this. So they have a long history of knowing these people, a long history, you could say, of envying their wealth. And now they're sort of told, well, you have a duty on your sugar that does not affect them, but it's in your pocket. So that's the second. This fear that the crown is selling them out for the interests of indigenous people, this awareness that they're being sort of taxed more heavily for the benefit of people who are already far wealthier than them, right? That's another form of resentment. And then we get the big one, an act for granting and applying certain stamp duties and other duties in the British colonies in America towards furthering defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the same. It's announced in March of 1764. The announcement is, we're going to work this up. Grenville put a lot of time into this because he had to figure out exactly how to gradate this. And I think a lot of discussions of the Stamp Act, this gets lost. So I put some time into this. I think it's kind of important. It's announced, it's passed on March 22nd, 1765. Here's a great Virginia trivia question. Does anybody know why Virginians might squint a little bit at the date March 22nd? That's the date in 1622 of Opechancano's uprising on the James River. So it's I don't know that anybody in the 1760s is thinking about that unless they're reading carefully. But that's a date that resonates in the larger history of Virginia. And then planned enforcement would begin on November 1st. It's a huge law. I was thinking it would be fun. I tried to see if I could get some sort of could I compress it and just give you the number of sheets of pages? I couldn't get the image I wanted. It's about 13,000 words, which is a very long law. But the reason why is because they wanted to be very precise. And I kind of think, this is just my thought on this, I kind of think that the precision, as you'll see in a second, the precision is actually what undid it. So we'll get to that in a second. Maybe less precise, it might have worked better. This is the offending object, a stamp. Seems like not a big deal. It's a really big deal because paper was central to not just running the empire, but living daily life. You needed paper all the time. Your deeds, your contracts, all sorts of things, court activities, all sorts of things had to go with paper. So colonists, and particularly landowners, free white landowners, and particularly people involved in the court, were very aware of how they were being singled out, how their sort of specific way of life within the colony was being singled out by this. And you find paper all over the place, just to show you how symbolic and important it is. This is the first portrait of George Washington we have, Charles Wilson Peel, in 1772. My book, The Permanent Resident, has a whole discussion of this uniform. I have some ideas about it. But in George's pocket are his orders of march for Braddock's campaign. Paper. Paper's very important and symbolic, so being able to write is important. So all this stuff takes on meaning that I think we lose sight of because we just think paper. We don't think about how much this stuff is central to how they live their lives. Now, here's the precision that I was talking about. Grenville and his people spent time identifying at least 55 different categories of paper that were used in the colonies, and then assigning a valuation to each of these kinds of papers. So a legal document, there's several different types, I sort of generalize, about 3 pence. Court documents, ones that are filed by the court, about 3 pence. Church documents are fairly low at 1 shilling. Always we're sticking it to college students, right? Everybody hates college students, so we're always trying to make them pay more than they need to pay. A degree of higher learning costs £2. So it's quite a burden there. A bill of lading, that's going to matter immensely for our story, is 4 pence. Privateer commission, 20 shillings. Not saying it's going to happen very often. The complexity, when you read the Stamp Act, the complexity of liquor licenses is quite remarkable. It's already a system for licensing, and it already costs money. But the legal right to sell wine with a liquor license is different than the legal right to sell wine without a liquor license. So you have to parse this stuff out. So Grenville and his team sort of do this whole survey of how these documents work. And it works all the way down to a deck of playing cards for 1 shilling and a newspaper ad for 1 shilling. So it's everything. This is just my personal thought. We need someone like John Kukla to tell me whether I'm right or wrong. I'll ask him, see what he says. But if they had simply said 2 shillings per piece of paper, right? Even 2 shillings is too much. Say 3 pence per piece of paper across the board, right? They might have gotten away with it. That might not have been so burdensome that it pushed people's buttons quite as much. It's this intricacy, this feeling of your bureaucracy is being turned against you, or it's sort of being pushed into it. Just a thought, but I wonder if it had just been more simple, if it might not have been received more the way it was received in Barbados and Jamaica. So then we move to enforcement. You can't fake these things. You'll be in trouble. There'll be commissioners appointed, and they will come to the colony or be people in the colony. There's some talk that Richard Henry Lee may have wanted to be the commissioner and didn't get it, and a lot of his resentment may be rooted in his not getting the job of being a commissioner. You always want these jobs in the empire because you skim. That's why you want a position in the empire, to skim from it. It's something the framers were singularly concerned about, and a grievance of theirs that comes up. So they're very worried about that, but it is the common practice in the empire. So there'll be an enforcement, there'll be somebody there to enforce. If you forge, you counterfeit. Offenses, then this last one, I don't want to read it in detail, but this one's very important. Offenses committed against. In respective colony or plantation where the offense will be committed, or in any court of vice admiralty appointed or to be appointed, and will have the jurisdiction, and determine the same by the election, so on and so on. So it's up to the person making, the legal authority making the accusation to determine whether the trial for whatever your infraction is will be in your county court, the way you normally would be tried, or even at the colonial court, or in an admiralty court. That should set off alarm bells. That is the British authority. That's an external authority that we as North Americans had no control over. The colonists had no say over this. So they see immediately that another legal authority is being inserted into this. They're very sensitive about this, in part because of the experience of the 7 Years' War. In the 7 Years' War, there were a lot of American troops fighting alongside the British troops. But you can imagine how this is when you have these British regular officers who've purchased their ranks, because that's what you do to get into the army. The Navy is a place of merit, but the army, you buy your way in. So you have a lot of these guys who come from good backgrounds, the classic place for second sons. The older brother's going to inherit the title and the land. The second son goes into the church or into the universities or into the army. So a lot of people with purchased rank who see themselves as far better than colonists are suddenly confronted with colonial soldiers, colonists themselves. And a captain in the regular army does not view a captain in the colonial militia as being equal to him. So there's a sort of had to confront all the time this sort of looking down. The other thing is that there's physical violence. The British Army uses physical discipline quite dramatically. Soldiers are flogged as a fairly routine way to deal with discipline. That did not happen in colonial military organizations where people are often related to each other, live in the same town, know one another. Flogging your brother-in-law for an infraction is a challenge, right? So that will come back to haunt you. But the British Army is able to do that and expects to be able to do that. So they have already been bristling over British authority. Now you add this insertion of courts of admiralty, and they're very worried about what that means. So that's sort of a fourth strike, right? Or third strike in here. But there's also the issue of the money, of being soaked, as they would perceive it. So fairly early in this process, Virginia leads the way with a conflict between Patrick Henry and Governor Francis Fauquier. Henry, this is stuff we don't need to go into great detail of, but Henry orates extensively against the Stamp Act. We don't know exactly what happened. There's a lot of uncertainty about what took place there. There's a lot of mythology, and a lot of it was spurred by Henry. But on in the end of May, the Burgesses, the House of Burgesses, the ruling assembly for Virginia, passed a series of resolves against the Stamp Act. They passed 5 of them. Henry left, and then the next day they repealed the 5th. So these things were passing by fairly narrow margins. So Virginians were not leading Virginians, right? The elite were not completely unified around this. Some of them were responding to the Stamp Act very much the way people in Barbados or Jamaica were. They were calm, but there's a lot of concern. A lot of this was generational. A lot of this had to do with a faction that Henry was a part of that was more aggressive than the older folks. But they passed 5 of these acts, and then something very strange happens, which some of you may know about, but I think it's one of the most interesting things that occurs in this. The printer in Williamsburg didn't print the acts, just didn't want to print them. There's an issue about paper, didn't want to print them, and sort of stepped back. And what ends up happening is someone gets versions of the resolves circulated. And it's not clear exactly who. I know that John Kukla, who's written about this extensively, doesn't think that it's Patrick Henry, thinks it's someone else. But someone is circulating a version of the acts that Virginia passed. They're fairly straightforward. Resolved the first adventurers, settlers of Majesty's colony, Dominion, Virginia, brought with them and transmitted their prosperity and other Majesty's subjects, inhabiting, so on and so on. All the liberties, privileges, franchises, and immunities that have at any time been enjoyed and possessed by people. So we're Britons, we're Englishmen, and we have those rights. Then the most radical is the 5th. They're mostly like this. They're very, if you know John Locke, you hear a lot of John Locke. I've highlighted in some of the other ones where you hear John Locke's language. So they're speaking the language of educated, elite Englishmen, and relying on precedents within English politics to make their cases. So resolved, therefore, the General Assembly of the colony, but that every attempt to vest such power, they're arguing that Parliament doesn't have the power to tax them. Taxes must come from us, not from an external authority. Which they see Parliament as being, and that any attempt to vest such power in any persons whatsoever is a manifest tendency to destroy British as well as American freedom. Well, that one's dramatic in part because it's claiming for Parliament authority, claiming for the House of Burgesses an authority that not everybody in the House of Burgesses agrees the House of Burgesses has. So it's a little rough. And then this kind of dramatic language of manifest tendency to destroy British as well as American freedom. So a version of this gets printed, and starts appearing in newspapers in other colonies. And there are 6 resolves. And then there's a printing that has 7. And they get successively more dramatic. So someone's printing these and making the language more intense. So this one, the one that's printed, there are differences, but I printed 6, which was in all 3 of these. It was in New York, it was in Maryland, and it was in Rhode Island. Result, any persons who shall by speaking or writing assert or maintain that any person or persons other than General Assembly deemed an enemy to this His Majesty's colony. Well, that's not what they passed. This now criminalizes speech. Right? You are now an enemy of the colony because of your speech. That's not really what was intended in this, but what happens is this goes out there and it fires up other colonies. Well, if the Virginians are going to weigh in that heavily, well, then we can weigh in too. And you start to get a wave of colony by colony, different Stamp Act results sort of happening in succession. And they mostly are restrained. Rhode Island's is one of the most intense because it makes some of the similar claims. But they touch on different issues. Some of them make a bigger deal about the concerns about the courts of admiralty. Some of them make a bigger deal about the language of John Locke. But each of them sort of follows their way. I've highlighted this where, in Pennsylvania, the natural rights of mankind, right? That's high British political language. This is right out of Locke, to be taxed only by his own consent. So that's very much the way this is getting framed as these resolves, sort of concern about the Stamp Act sort of passes its way through. Massachusetts, no man can justly take the property of another man without his consent, right? So we see these things repeated again and again. So we get this sort of building of a consensus through these resolves, through these resolutions. It culminates with the Stamp Act Congress in New York. Now, what happened in the wake of the Virginia resolves is that Governor Fauquier disbanded the Burgesses, sent them home. So they were not able to attend, which is another strike that sort of riles people up here, losing their representative body in response to this. So Virginians are not part of the Stamp Act Congress, but the words of Virginians are echoing in the room. And you can see as we went through the list of the 13 points, their rights to petition, they state their allegiance to the crown. They're also, this is very important, saying they're not disloyal. It's not a challenge to the crown. They are concerned about a law. No taxes should be imposed without their consent. Colonies are not represented in the House of Commons in Great Britain. Only representatives of the colonies can tax them. No one can give their property away from them. Trial by jury is an inherent and invaluable right of every Briton. That's the courts of admiralty. So they're going through sort of the laundry list of all the things that are concerning all the colonies. Lots of very high-minded petitions. And what happens in response to all that? You heard that silence? That was it. That's what happens. Nothing. There's no need to listen. So it's simply ignored. All the resolves, all the petitions are ignored. And that leads the colonists most concerned about this to then move to another form of enforcement. And that's when things start to get ugly. So they move to directly blocking enforcement of the Stamp Act, all happening as we get closer and closer to the time in November when this law is going to go into effect. So you have commissioners arriving to find themselves met with mobs, arriving to find themselves attacked in some cases, and many of them sort of turn tail and say, oh, I'm not going to do this. This isn't what I signed up for. So you start to get a pattern to these acts in keeping with the way Britons generally responded to stuff they didn't like. Riot, throwing rocks, mobs, ridicule, effigies, all this stuff is very common in English political practice. This one from New Hampshire, sort of a great shot of a man in effigy and also throwing rocks at him. The most dramatic and perhaps the most famous of these acts is what happened to Thomas Hutchinson, who was Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. His home was ransacked. They broke all the windows. They ran through the house. They stole all the furniture. They even pulled the wainscoting off the wall. They cut all the trees down in the garden. So it's sort of, and they did the same thing, a similar thing to the stamp master who a couple days before. So the people in Boston made very clear where their sentiments were. But we'd moved into a space of violence at this point. They're starting to attack people and property more directly. It happened here. In a rather elaborate, which again, it's kind of a great little moment, but Richard Henry Lee led a very elaborate procession to the Montrose Courthouse to challenge and try to drive off George Mercer. And they hung an effigy of him, they hung an effigy of Grenville. So that's the first sort of, after the disbanding of the House of Burgesses, this is the first sort of major act we have. Then, right as the Stamp Act was going to go into force, the Westmoreland County Court justices refused to enforce it. And this is another thing you had. You had houses of burgesses saying, legislative assemblies saying, well, we're just not going to enforce the law. So that was their response. So that brings us back to here. Dates are always confusing in the 18th century, if you didn't know this. Before the 1750s, they were on a different calendar, so we lose time. George Washington, for example, would have told you that his birthday was February 11th, not February 22nd, because that was the date in the calendar that he was on. And then you also have the fact that the year turns for them in March, not in January, which is why, those of you who know your Constitution, when is the president to be inaugurated? March 4th. It's my brother's birthday. That's why I know it. But it's but March 4th, right? Because that's the beginning of the new year in many people's thinking. So it gets very confusing when you read these things, whether it's 6 or 5, right? So by convention, what a lot of historians will do is use the current numbering system to make it not look like 1 year goes on forever. So in some people's minds, this still would have been 1765, but this is after the moment of enforcement in November. So late on in the story, we've already had the event at Montrose, we've already had violence taking place across the colonies, already had the resolves and resolutions rejected, and then we get this. We get the mob. Let's look at some language for a second. These are the opening statements of 3 of the different sets of resolves passed by the various houses, various legislatures. First, adventurous settlers of His Majesty's colony, sounds a lot like Virginia, doesn't it? In Dominion of Rhode Island and Providence Plantation, brought with them and transmitted to their posterity, and so on and so on. Pennsylvania, the House, taking into consideration that an act of Parliament has lately passed in England for imposing certain stamp duties, got it. New Jersey, whereas the late Act of Parliament called the Stamp Act is found to be utterly subversive of privileges inherent in and originally secured by grants and confirmations from the Crown. That's a little dramatic. Utterly is a good word. It's a strong word, right? Look at the first paragraph of the Leedstown Resolutions. Roused by danger and alarmed at attempts, foreign and domestic, to reduce the people of this country to a state of abject and detestable slavery by destroying that free and happy condition of government under which they have hitherto lived, we who subscribe this paper have associated to bind ourselves to each other, to God and to our country, by the firmest ties that religion and virtue can frame, most sacredly and punctually to stand by, and with our lives and fortunes to support, maintain, and defend each other in the observance and execution of these following articles. That, you might want to calm down a little, right? It's like, maybe take a walk around the block, right? This is a little intense. It is the first in this sequence, the first invocation of slavery. It matters immensely that it happens here. Whereas Barbados would be a place where about 90% of people were enslaved. Virginia, across the colonies, about 50%. I don't know the exact numbers for Westmoreland, but it's probably roughly in that space. Anytime, and all of the people, I can't say all, but most of the people, certainly the prominent people who signed this are slaveholders and are operating within a slaveholding economy, right? So they're enslavers. This is what they do in order to sort of make a living. This is the nature of the economic system in this colony. For them to invoke slavery at this moment is really quite fascinating, and historians have focused in on this considerably. It was noted at the time, right? I mean, Samuel Johnson has that famous quotation, why is it that we always hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes, right? Which is exactly what, or more or less exactly what his quote is. That's the question that historians are still asking. What is happening that these people, who are themselves so directly connected with enslavement, are also the ones who are speaking most loudly about liberty? Is it that they see the contrast? Is that it? Is this an abstract thing? One of the things I always talk about with students when we do sort of the survey course and go through the whole frame is that there's a big difference in the mindset of slaveholders at the time of the Revolution versus at the time of the Civil War. We shouldn't think of them as sort of being one single thing. There's an enormous difference. For the most part, you find that people at the time of the Revolution, enslavers, were sort of willing to ask questions about the logic of slavery. They understood, and many of them did, Washington certainly did, Jefferson certainly did, understood that there's a contradiction in their own calls for liberty and their own practices of enslavement. It's such a big deal for Washington because he's such a prominent figure. He has people sending him pamphlets, friends are sending him pamphlets saying, you are the great hero of liberty, and yet here you are enslaving people. So he has abolitionist pamphlets on his bookshelf, had them bound together, What he read of them, we're not really sure, but he has them. He spent a winter after the Revolution with Lafayette, who was an ardent abolitionist. He spent a winter, and we don't know what they talked about. We don't have the text of what they talked about. But we do know from people who saw that they spent the winter talking about slavery. And that Lafayette had been earlier in writing urging Washington to join him in projects of freeing enslaved people, and suggested that he could put people out in West Virginia as free and sort of run villages, like help them set up villages. And Washington expressed sympathy with that project, but we could say, like the planters in Barbados, I think similarly, but thinking is all I will do, right? So Washington had very clear thoughts about this, and as you probably know, he manumitted his own enslaved people at the time of his death, he's not the only one who did it. There are others who did it as well. So there's a willingness to say there's something tricky in slavery in this generation. Their grandsons and great-grandsons at the time of the Civil War cannot say that. They have a completely different attitude. For them, slavery has become the absolute order of the world and cannot be changed, cannot be challenged. So we have to be careful in how we talk about how these people understood slavery. And when we look at the Leedstown Resolves, when we see slavery brought up there, it's a fascinating choice of words coming from this context. But it tells you the intensity of their feeling. It's not an abstract word for them. I mean, we collectively, we've all had children, right? Everyone's had a kid or knows a kid, and the kid at some point is starving. I'm starving in the back of the car while you're driving somewhere. They're not starving, but they're using this word to sort of gin up the drama, right? To make a point. And here we are seeing the word slavery invoked for the first time in this, and that's deeply significant. But what they do, and we go through, we say we have more of these, they declare their allegiance, but if therefore any person or persons shall attempt by any action or proceeding to deprive this colony of these fundamental rights, we will immediately regard him or them as the most dangerous enemy of the community, and we will go to any extremity, not only to prevent the success of such attempts, but to stigmatize and punish the offender. So one of the things the Leedstown Resolves contains within it is punishment. It's not just this is the level at which we're operating in the intensity, but we're prepared to punish. And so what happens next is they go back to Ritchie's. About 400 of them this time, though. And they coerce an apology out of him. And the apology, if you take a minute and look at it, you could look at it in other sources, it's kind of appalling. It's clearly a coerced document, full of sort of over-the-top claims. Sensible now of the high insult I offered this country by declaring in Richmond court lately my determination to make use of stamped paper for clearing out my vessels. He obviously didn't write this. This is written for him. But this is what's beginning to happen. And then immediately after, within a month in Britain, the act is repealed. The damage it's doing to trade is so powerful that there's enough of a constituency to overturn it. And overturning is not a small affair. This is an act that was signed by the king. You may not think of it all the time, but Britain is a theocracy. The head of church is the head of state. It's the same person. When you stop at a stop sign in Great Britain, that is a commandment from God through his agent, the king, through his agents in parliament and local governance. That's what it is to be in a theocracy. The two authorities of religion and state are merged in the same person. You don't overturn an act that the king has agreed to rather lightly. It's a difficult thing, but this gets overturned, and it's the end of it. Of course, it's not the end of it. What the Stamp Act did, for better or worse, was it trained the colonists, the free white colonists making these claims. It trained them to see a certain language, to see a certain kind of power. It gave them a sense of language. It brought into focus what specific grievances would be within the empire. And then, as further acts came, they already sort of had the groundwork in place to understand what's happening. They don't relent. Grenville ultimately leaves, but you continue to get acts. And they focus in, there's acts about tea, there's acts about imports. So you get more and more taxation, and all these issues become highlighted. So when we talk about the Leedstown Resolves, one of the things that's super important about them is their language sounds almost 10 years at a time. The intensity of that language is far in advance of what anybody else is saying at the time. We have to keep in mind when we talk about the Stamp Act particularly, we're not talking about revolution. That's not what's going on here. There isn't a sense of being not British anymore or somehow having a different government. That language doesn't exist. But you don't get to that language until you go through overturning law, saying that they're going to be null and void, that we're going to actually punish people who try to enact the law. These are little steps that get you closer to the point where you start to say, okay, there can be independence. And when there is independence, when they finally move to that place, only about a third of free white colonists support the project. About a third are loyalists and say, I can't go this far. And they're sort of falling by the wayside from the Stamp Act forward. Virtually universal opposition to the Stamp Act. But as things go further along and these kinds of violent protests get more intense, you have more and more people saying, I cannot participate in this. I can't be part of this. My loyalties are there. And then you get a third who are indifferent, who would rather just be left alone. But the war, of course, sort of precludes that possibility. So what we see in the Leedstown Resolves that matters for sort of the grand frame is the stepping stone, this sort of preparation of language, this ratcheting up of intensity that echoes in reverse, sort of what we're going to hear soon. Now we have a minute or two spare before we get to questions. And I want to make one or two points about here, just so that I know I said something about here, right? Augustine Washington Jr. passed away in 1762. So he didn't have anything to do with this. He misses all this. He knew that the war had ended, presumably. Gout doesn't affect your hearing, does it? Right? You can still read if you got gout, right? So yeah, so he at least could read newspapers. So he was not part of this. But during the period of the Stamp Act crisis, this is a female-run plantation here. His widow, Anne Aylett Washington, was running the show. And in the midst of the Stamp Act, this is going back to sort of material culture and importance of objects, a ceramic type comes out the same year, actually, that Augustine Washington Jr. dies. It's called creamware, and it takes over the marketplace. It's one of the most important English ceramic exports, and we find it everywhere. It's a wonderful marker for us. On this site, when you talk about the archaeology here, anytime we find creamware, that has to be after Augustine Washington Jr.'s death. So we immediately can tell that we're looking at features or areas that are later. This enters the marketplace right as these acts are coming in. So there's this extra sting in this. There's this new ceramic that they want and is getting very popular and sort of locking them into English goods even more. The other thing to keep in mind is the amount of lovely stuff that Augustine Washington Jr. had in his house is staggering. He's an extremely wealthy man, deeply embedded in the empire, in the practice of imperial purchasing. You probably can't see it here too well, but I picked this page because it's got his 25 gallons of molasses. Well, molasses was taxed in the Sugar Act. So we see them sort of having English goods and colonial goods, sort of imperial goods imported. And then the other thing that speaks to this other point is the largest amount of investment that he had in his inventory after his death was in enslaved people. So most of his wealth, the largest single group of category of wealth that he had, was in the form of his enslaved population. So all of this is sort of swimming around during the Stamp Act crisis and the lead up to the Revolution. Nobody from here is going to be directly involved in the Revolution, but Anne Aylett Washington is going to be managing this estate. And one of the things she's dealing with also are values and income from the mines that Augustine Washington Sr. established. And she's writing back and forth as the Revolution's beginning to unfold. We're in the later stages, 1774. She's writing to people in Birmingham to make sure that she can protect what she has coming to her from her interests in the mines. So during all of this crisis that we've been talking about happening in Montrose and all the drama, here the plantation is shifting to being a female-run household, and she is very adept, Anne Aylett Washington is very adept at controlling her side of the business. She goes to court, she's able to write these letters back and forth and secure her mine property. So even as the sundering is beginning to happen, you see here working very hard to secure property and make sure that people's lives can continue to be lived as they were. So I'll stop there, and hopefully there'll be some questions, or hopefully there'll be questions I can answer. Let's stick to those. Those are the better kind. Just one last image just for us. How do you pay for the Civil War? Stamp tax. It's on every photograph. 3 cents. Every photograph had to have a stamp on the back.
Dr. Levy, thank you.
Sure.
That was just fascinating. It's such a fresh look
Thanks.
at the Resolves. That was just fantastic. So let's open up the floor to some questions. And we want to make sure that everybody can hear really well. So if you would wait for us to get a microphone to you, and Dustin's going to help me With that, so I see we've already got a gentleman right here.
Restrict them to ones I can answer.
Yes. Let's go back to the satirical cartoon, if you could.
Yeah, sure. The of the end of the Stamp Act. This one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I was so struck by the peeing dog because there's another famous satire of the Edenton Tea Party or something about that. That is an image that can be incorporated into. And do you know what is that a coffin of a child?
Okay, I can answer that question. Thank you. That echoes Franklin, who said that Grenville was in love with the Stamp Act, or was besotted by the Stamp Act. That's Grenville carrying the coffin in which the Stamp Act lays, carrying it to its burial, right? His child, as it were. And significantly, who is the dog peeing on? It's a clergyman.
I never noticed that.
Yeah, these cartoons are wonderful. They're very biting. Great question. But yes, that's Grenville weeping over the Stamp Act that he put so much time into.
I'd like for you to respond. The driving force of the American Revolution was that the people who lived in the so-called 13 colonies had come not to consider themselves British, but Americans, differing from the people who ran Jamaica, who continued to consider themselves British, in fact, lived in London.
Well, the ones who lived in London obviously had a very strong connection to Britain. William Byrd II lives in London for about half of his life. He's the wealthiest man in Virginia, but he lives in London for half of his life. And remember, in all the documents, it's their rights as Englishmen that they keep on calling, right? So they use the language of being Englishmen. The other thing that happens that's terribly important for this is there's a wave of migration from Britain after the Treaty of Paris. Land is hard to get in England. There's not a lot, it's finite. There's more in America. And America might be a great place to go, but there's this problem because you hear stories about Native Americans on the frontier who periodically, well, not so much in the settled parts of the colonies, but there's still a lot of stories about raids in Deerfield, Massachusetts, and so on. There's a fear of indigenous people. There also is fear of the French, who are very powerful and very scary. Once that is over, there are a lot of Britons who say, I'm ready to go now. And so there's a very large migration. And a lot of the people who are active in the revolution are people who were not indigenous to North America. They're Britons who came over and have rights as Britons and find themselves being denied those rights and act like Britons. So there's always a debate around this, but Edmund Morgan writes about how much the revolutionary language is tied to the norm of British politics, how much this sits within British political discourse. So there is this notion of Americans, but it's very unformed and it's very locally specific. It gets invoked on occasion, but Virginians don't talk that way. Virginians understand themselves as Virginians, which they understand as being a species of Englishmen. They have a number of problems that emerge from this. One of the ones, when my wife and I were driving up here, we saw the church in Oak Grove, which I had visited several times, had wonderful conversations with people there, looking for different graves. I was trying to find Sarah Taylor Washington's grave. It's not there. I think it's in the Oak Grove Cemetery. But looking for that grave, and I'd seen that church. It dates to what, 1830, I think? It's first half of the 19th century, right? Irreplaceable object, right? There are a finite number of these things. But it's an Episcopal church. Virginian elites are Anglicans. The Anglican Church is the official church of England. So they have a terrible problem because their church, which goes to the king, they have to deal with. So the creation of the Episcopal Church is a response to the American Revolution. So they are, every time they go to church, and a lot of the elites are members of the vestry. We know Washington was very deeply involved in this, very deeply involved in the activities of the church. They're not personally pious in many ways. That's not really their thing. George certainly isn't. He tends to talk about posterity and destiny. He sounds more Roman when he talks about these things. And I did, you go through their wills, you look through the succession of Washington men wills, and it's really fun. grim thing to say, right? But the level of religiosity that you see in, say, John Washington's will, where the first 2 paragraphs of it are just an outline of the Anglican theory of salvation. It just like runs through it. It's in great detail. When you get to George, it's in the name of God the Father, amen. And then here's what I want to do with my land. So there's this declension. But they're all active, or those elites are active in the Anglican Church, which is the English church, and they know it. So they have this regular reminder that's very meaningful to them in their activity and their religious life of their Englishness. So what they're doing is a species of Englishness. And at some point, like I say, I think the way we tend to see it is that it's Britain who starts to change the rules. And the result is that English people don't feel they're being treated as English people are supposed to be being treated. And as we saw with the Leedstown Resolves, they go to this metaphor of slavery, which is fascinating. And that's where you start to get a new thing. So it's really, when you look at, when we talk about this period, it's not until Andrew Jackson that we really start to talk about a new thing fully coming in, right? That there's a huge disjuncture at that point. Even though obviously the revolution represents a disjuncture, you have to wait a generation or 2 before you really start to get to something that really does look American and different. And that's de Tocqueville talking with people and how Americans talk and how they're different than Europeans. These folks are still British, and it's an American species of British. It's a Virginia species of British, but that's how they understand themselves. Archibald Ritchie was a Scot. Scots, and the word Scot and Presbyterian is interchangeable in the 18th century. So we'll talk about a Presbyterian merchant or a Scot merchant, interchangeable, and they are deeply tied to merchant houses in Glasgow and bringing trade back and forth. So they're not severed yet. People are still very much linked. And that's why the revolution is so socially disorienting, because you have a lot of people that do see themselves as really truly being of this place, and a lot of other people who are of this place but still feel very connected to what they would call the mother country. And many of them return.
Wouldn't it be correct to refer to, can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Wouldn't it be correct to refer to Westmoreland County Courthouse as opposed to Montrose?
Yeah, I mean, Montrose exists. That word exists at the time. But yeah, that's where the activity takes place.
And
Yeah.
with Western Virginia as opposed to West Virginia?
Well, in what context? What do you mean?
It's on the context you use, because there was no West Virginia
Right, but
at the time.
it's just like, what do you do with dates, right? You have to devise a convention. Western Virginia, we, without explanation, will understand as being part of Virginia. West Virginia is another place, even though at the time it's part of Virginia. A lot of these lands are in West Virginia. They're in proper West Virginia. So like Charlestown. Charlestown is named after Charles Washington. So that's in West Virginia proper. But at the time, it's Western Virginia. So you just develop the habit of the distinction so that people can understand.
Sure.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? And if you look at the maps, look at these colonial maps, they draw the eastern boundaries that are familiar to you, and then anytime you see a straight line, it just keeps on going, right? It just goes all the way out. Connecticut goes all the way out, and it's humorous on one level, but it actually leads to real conflict. Connecticut makes claims pretty far west, and they overlap with claims that Pennsylvania makes. There are claims in western Pennsylvania, in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. There are land claims there that Virginians are also making. And you get a shooting war over this. Like, people are shooting each other because I've got my land claim, and I get out there and there's a Pennsylvanian on that land claiming it's his. You have conflict. Every time you see a straight line on any map, that's a result of a political conflict. Because rivers and mountains mark natural lines. Straight lines have to be agreed upon, and not everybody agrees. And all of the straight lines, the border between North Carolina and Virginia was contested. The border between Maryland and Virginia was challenged. The border between Virginia and Pennsylvania is challenged. So, the Virginians want that border to be here, right? And the North Carolinians want it to be there, right? So you have to go settle exactly where that line's going to be. So yeah, the straight lines cause those problems.
What were the other colonies?
Oh, I can't list them all, but St. Kitts, Jamaica, obviously Quebec is a colony at this point. So Bahamas, right? It's the West Indies sort of broken up into different jurisdictions. But yeah, and they do not. Although St. Kitts had a pretty aggressive anti-Stamp Act riot, where they knock people about. I mean, they did the kind of stuff you see in the mainland. Whereas the Barbadians are just so careful. They're just so careful. And like I said, he has this line that we must follow the government as we are but a little people, right? This real sense of caution. But another big difference when you get later in the revolution, when you get, or on the lead up to the revolution, when you get things like the Quartering Act, when you start to get soldiers housed in people's homes, people resenting the presence of soldiers in their streets, no white person in Barbados objects to the presence of soldiers or men of war, sitting at anchor, because that's their security, right? In a place where 90% of the people are enslaved, seeing those redcoats, seeing those forts that dot the southern coast of Barbados, that's all protection. So they have a very different outlook on what the empire means and how the empire functions. It doesn't hurt that so many of them, particularly the wealthiest ones, policymakers, are able to live in London for long periods of time, and that they make so much money off of that trade that they're not going to let that go. So that's why they stay in the Commonwealth. Barbados was in the Commonwealth only until, does anybody know, 4 years ago? 4 or 5 years ago, it's right, something like that. It pulled out of the Commonwealth and became a republic. But that was a big political debate in Barbados about whether to stay in the Commonwealth or become a republic. They finally became, under Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, they became a republic and not a Commonwealth. We got to see her campaign one year. It was great.
We've got time for a couple more questions if you have them.
Sure.
I'm wondering, in your search of the text, did you spend much time looking at the consumer reports, the records of the goods that were coming in and out of the Rappahannock Potomac?
Yeah, so I do in my regular work. It's something I deal with a lot. I've been working a lot on the Washington family here. So I've spent a lot of time with Westmoreland County Records. I have more work to do with them, but I spent a lot of time there and seeing what's coming and going. The shipping records are not great. They don't often list full cargoes. They're very good records about enslaved people being brought in. So that's a species of commodity, right, that we have very good records on. And a lot of that stuff actually is database. So you could go to something called Slave Voyages. It's like slavevoyages.org. It's a complicated database, but it's huge. And it has an enormous amount of information about what ships are coming in and which are coming where. I just put together, actually right before I came here from Florida for something else, I put together a spreadsheet of all of the voyages coming into the Potomac and the Rappahannock that brought enslaved people in. And I was able to identify about 100 voyages that brought people in varying numbers, small groups of 15 or 20, and I think the largest group is about 300. But all told, it was something like about 36,000 people brought in the entire period, coming to the Rappahannock and the Potomac. So there we get some records. Where you see people's material goods, though, is less at the point of shipping or delivery, but more in things like inventories. So if you're interested in this stuff, the place to go is inventories. Does everybody know that procedure? What happens? Everything has to be taxed, everything has to be settled, and you need documents for things because estates have to be managed, and there has to be agreement about what's in the estate so that we don't get lawsuits. So it's all by way of heading off conflict. So what will happen is after someone's death, particularly wealthy people, but after their death, the court will appoint inspectors to do a walkthrough of the estate and record everything that's in the estate. We use this record for a lot of different things. One of the things it does that nobody would have anticipated is it gives us an idea of what houses look like because they move through and they tell us the names of rooms. Now, there's a catch, which is that if there's nothing in the room, they don't talk about the room. So we always say like it's a minimum of 8 rooms because there could be a room there wasn't anything in. And then they also have words like lumber that they use. And lumber doesn't mean wood the way we would use it. It means more like to be lumbered with something. It just means sundries, right? Stuff. Not defined. But they go through and they create this very detailed list and then put a valuation on everything so you can see the price of stuff. And they're happening constantly because people are dying and the records are always being kept up. So to look at people's material culture from a documentary perspective, what they have, things like inventories are invaluable. It's also where you see enslaved people. The 2 places you see the most, and particularly this I know because I've been writing about it, in Westmoreland County, the places you see them the most are wills and inventories. We don't have a lot of farm books that survive. George Washington kept very good farm books, and the farm books survive. And as a consequence, we know stuff about that enslaved community, the enslaved community in Mount Vernon, that we don't know about others. In working on the enslaved community here, I was very fortunate that we have William Augustine Washington's account book from roughly 1776 till about 1792, dealing with all of his business transactions. So we can see goods moving in there, and he talks about enslaved people once he's purchasing, once he's selling, and once he's hiring out or renting. So we get some stuff there. Like I said, George Washington had farm books that dealt with who was pregnant when, who was sick on what day, like phenomenal records. So you can really burrow in there. And there's a database online that you could go to, a free database called the Mount Vernon Enslaved Community Database that Mount Vernon runs. That's just a fabulous site for just kind of going through and seeing what these records look like, and it was there. But when it comes to material goods, you really, the way to see like what's playing out and what people have is in the inventories. They're hard to get at, right? They're written like this. There's the people who do transcriptions of the court records. They don't do the inventories. They do the court cases, and they do a great job with them. But then they just kind of summarize the inventories. It's a lot of work to sit down and transcribe pages and pages of this kind of stuff. Well,
The shipping records will give you a sense of, the wider world.
right, where things are going and coming from.
Where the
Right.
ships, one of the last 2 ships in before the Leedstown Resolves came in from Boston.
Right.
So they're bringing in, exchanging information.
No, I mean, this has been one of the biggest innovations of the last 25 years of scholarship. And this is why when you look back at older work on the Revolution, there's a hole in it. And the phrase that we all use is the Atlantic world, right? This awareness of what we call the Atlantic world now. This awareness that these places are not living in isolation from one another, and they're constantly interacting. So April Hatfield has a book called Atlantic Virginia that deals with the movement of trade along the coasts and between the islands. Just in like I mentioned before, in the issue of how enslaved people are coming here, the role that Barbados plays in that, and the role that Virginians play in provisioning Barbados. So getting more of an awareness of the interconnectedness of these places, and it's not just English-speaking places. There's trade with Brazil. There's trade with the Dutch. The Dutch play an enormous role in this also. So rather than thinking of these places as isolated, we start to see them more as inhabiting this broader Atlantic world with goods and ideas moving all over the place. And people as well, people moving around. So, and I say that's past 25 years or so, that's probably been the most important innovation in early American scholarship, sort of opening this up and recognizing that these places are all interconnected much more than an older generation of scholarship would have understood.
Dr. Levy, I think we need to stop, but
Okay.
Would you be willing to hang around?
Yeah, sure,
and talk
sure.
with folks after?
Sure.
Thank
Let's do
you
it where
for
it's
that.
cooler, but yeah.
And also, thank you again
Right.
so much.
And thank you for coming out. Thank you.
As we wrap